wanted to go ahead and make a video again about self-diagnosis, but I wanted to focus on the topic of privilege. And this is a word that seems to be thrown around a lot, and certainly there are times that it is warranted, for lack of a better word. It makes sense to use in a way that, certain people are privileged. They have certain opportunities, but there comes a point when a word gets overused, and it seems like this idea of privilege has gone beyond how it should really be used to the extent that it has been. And this also relates back to, in some ways, the video I made about identity in a lot of ways, because the conversations socially, on like a broader social level, are very much connecting identity and privilege and all these other kind of social ideas and conversations going on right now. One thing that I've specifically heard is the phrase, the privilege of getting a diagnosis. And this seems to be, frankly, a rather inciting phrase, almost an inflammatory phrase, in the way that it's meant. It, when it's said, it is always said with this idea that the person who is not attuned or clued in on whatever privilege or what have you, that they're just ignorant, or they don't know, or they don't care, or they're purposefully, not caring or ignoring these other issues. And that seems, like I said, this idea of privilege seems to be getting thrown around so often now that the word itself doesn't really seem to mean what it might have once meant, and it doesn't seem to hold the power and the meaning that it once did. And there's several reasons why I really don't like this discussion regarding this idea of the privilege of a diagnosis. And now, mind you, this is speaking specifically from the US. That being said, I know there are similar programs in some other Western countries, or not necessarily Western, but, English, predominantly white, and so, right. There are similar options or what have you in other places, but I'm speaking specifically from the US. And also keep in mind, what I'm saying, unless I say otherwise, is going to be true in every state. It's just how it works in the states, because these are set up on these structures are set up on the federal level. They are not, well, they aren't run by the federal government, but they are kind of structured from the top down by the federal government. So, it starts up at the top, if you will, and it goes down into the states for them to kind of run it as they see fit at the local level. But like I said, the general structure of it is going to be the same in every state. So, yes, and part of the reason why I'm also having this discussion, and it is going to be exclusive to English speaking places. Um, a lot of this discussion regarding this privilege of a diagnosis and so on, is happening in this English speaking space, at least as far as I've heard. Um, yeah, um, that'd be an interesting topic to go down. But so here's several things. Now, this also pertains to adults. People like to say that it is very, very much pain to get a diagnosis as an adult. Um, Vocational rehab, if you are unable to find a job or you have difficulty having a job because of a condition that you have, if you do not have a condition, but you would need a diagnosis in order to get accommodations, they will pay for your diagnosis. And I don't know personally how it works, but number one, I have been told by people that work there that that is one thing that they do. Um, and number two, I do know there is at least one adult um, that I have been in contact with who has been able to get a diagnosis through vocational rehab as an adult. So there you go. Now I know it might be harder to find somebody to do the assessment, but it's paid for, so there you go. Um, Also, community clinics, while they may not be your first choice, they are a way to get a foot in the door. And a lot of people with autism do have comorbid issues. So if you get diagnosed with, depression, anxiety, something that is commonly comorbid, that is, likely to happen, especially in somebody who goes undiagnosed for a prolonged period of time. Get, one of those uh, diagnoses that it's not that it's easier, that's not a good way to put it, but more doctors are able to kind of assess for those sort of conditions and provide a course of treatment. Now, when you get that diagnosis, then you can use that diagnosis to apply for more services for mental health funding and other support services, which you could then use to get an additional autism diagnosis if you did not want to go through vocational rehab. And I do want to add a caveat on the vocational rehab. Just because you are in vocational rehab does not mean 100% that you have to get a job. That is the goal. That is what you're working towards. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So, hint, hint, wink, wink, do with that information what you will. If you need a diagnosis, okay. Also, there's court-ordered treatment. that is a way that people do get diagnosed. People think, oh, those doctors in the hospital, they don't. Doctors in the hospital have seen autism, even at these county-run hospitals. It may be more difficult to get a full assessment, but in terms of kind of getting a diagnosis on the books or getting referrals and so on, um, you know, you, that's a that is a place to start that actually does work. So, and one thing people come up with after they say all that is, I'm not um, impaired enough, or I'm not whatever. My symptoms aren't severe enough for me to need services. Um, then, quite frankly, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and this is how this ties back into the previous discussion or my previous video on identity. But if it is not impairing, and you can easily get a job, and you can live your adult life, and I'm not saying you can easily live your adult life. Notice I said you can get a job. You can get a job. Not maybe not easy, but you can get a job. Just like similarly enough to peers of your age group. Um, you can live your life, an adult, whatever that means, um, similarly to peers of your age group. So, and that doesn't mean you can meal prep every week, because that's not what most people do in their life. So, if you can't do that, and you're upset and you think you're not functioning in life, that's not how this works. Um, you know, People, even when they're not disabled, can't just go all the time. So, also this idea of like burnout. Yes, burnout is a very real thing, but maybe it's a little bit kind of overplayed somewhat. Um, but without getting too much off topic, yeah, this idea of someone having to be bad enough off to get services, if you do not have severe enough symptoms to get services, then and you cannot get a diagnosis, and you do not have a diagnosis, and like have never at all in your life been diagnosed, then there is frankly no reason for you to just be identifying as autistic because you have self-diagnosed, regardless of how many hours of research you have done, because that is just not realistic. Even if you get into this idea of masking and all these other things, people who mask can still get a diagnosis. Adults who mask can still get a diagnosis. People think, doctors don't know about these things, and okay, yes, there are going to be doctors everywhere who are going to say backwards things. There might even be, doctors along the referral process that make things very difficult. But here's the thing: you have to go see a specialist for autism, and specialists, by and large, and again, I may be speaking at a regional level, and again, there are going to be doctors here that are a little bit out of or a lot out of date. But but a lot of these professionals, particularly any professional that is willing to do an assessment for an adult, um, I would imagine is going to know their stuff. And a consequence of knowing their stuff is they stay up to date on these medical studies. They have to do continuing education. Many people, they're interested in this topic. That's why they went into this field. So they stay up to date because they want to. They get newsletters on all these articles. They have clients that are talking about all these things. So, they've heard of masking. They've heard of burnout. They've heard of all these topics. So people want to sit back and say, "Oh, I'll never get, I won't get, um, picked up because, or my, I won't. They won't realize I'm autistic because, um, it's not I'm masking, but." When you have someone doing an assessment for an adult, that is not at this day and age like a realistic excuse if you're having an assessment done from somebody who is assessing adults. Um, and that again, people have been talking about this gender and race thing now for a decade and how it relates to autism for over a decade, okay? The DSM 5 was published in 2013. The reason that the autism spectrum disorder was subsumed from the old, it used to be 5 different disorders. Um, 2 disorders were kind of well, one was completely taken out because it's genetic. One is sort of taken out in the sense that it it's usually genetic. So when it is genetic, it's not autism. But if anyway, the main three: PDD, NOS, Asperger's, and infantile or classic autism got subsumed into autism spectrum disorder. The reason that happened was because of discrepancies with girls and minority children being diagnosed with different disorders and therefore getting different accommodations. So girls were more likely to get a diagnosis of Asperger's, so they didn't get as much accommodations compared to boys because girls are just more social. So that's how that played. It wasn't that necessarily girls weren't getting diagnosed, they were to a certain extent. However, they were also getting a kind of lighter diagnosis that was considered at the time. And the same was true of minority children. Um, it was kind of seen as, are they having a conduct issue or is this really just less severe autism kind of thing? But that's slowly starting to, the studies on that are being known, and there's a reason that this was subsumed into a spectrum disorder. And it wasn't. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't just race. There was no sound science that could clearly kind of clearly tell the doctors which which what differences are between the three, other than kind of these. It was very complicated. And it wound up, they found it wound up being very arbitrary, and it was supposed to be very, by the book, and that's not how it wound up being done. And then you wound up with biases like girls being more likely to be diagnosed with Asperger's, even though they display the exact same symptoms. Um, it was complicated, um, but as I said, these these studies have been out. The medical community has known about them and has been talking about them. The medical community has known about it because the medical community is the one that got it changed to autism spectrum disorder by the time the DSM 5 was published in 2013. That's how that works. So, yeah, that's how that works. And don't get me wrong, I am not saying um, every clinician is going to know this, but we need to get off this old narrative that clinicians just don't know about this, and they're just it's just so hard to find a diagnosis, and it's just too costly because here's a bunch of reasons why it's not. You can get a diagnosis paid for. There are so many ways to get it paid for, and if you don't have severe enough symptoms, then maybe we should get off this narrative that autism is an identity. Autism is something you can identify with. Autism is something that you can see the traits in yourself. That's not how that works. Identifying yourself within the traits, that's what you're doing still. And that's not how a diagnosis of a condition works. That's not how having a condition works. So, again, we need to go back to this idea of autism at the end of the day is a disorder. It is disabling, it is an impairment. That's why it is a medical condition. That's why it is defined by the medical community. If people want to, come up with some new term that describes everything about autism, but it's not the word autism because that's a medical diagnosis. If they want to make up their new word, that's a social identity, they should go do that. I would give, more power to them. I would love if they would do that. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's not gatekeeping to say autism is a disorder because it is, by definition, a diagnosis. Okay? There's no amount of social progress that is going to change the fact that autism came from the medical community and is a medical condition. That you cannot change that. So it's not some simple identity. That's just not how these things work. That's getting into this neoliberal, nihilistic lack of boundaries, and it is just taking things too far. There has to be a limit. There has to be a limit. And that is where neoliberalism gets into this nihilistic mentality where it just drives things and drives things and drives things until the end. And tries to push things too far in this guise that it's being progressive and accepting and, including people and including people who maybe should have gotten got a diagnosis but didn't. That's just, letting people fantasize at the end of the day. And it's enabling people to live in a world that is not real. That's what it's doing. It is not helping people. It is not helping people who actually have a diagnosis. And it's not helping people who need a diagnosis. Because it spreads around all these myths that, oh, a diagnosis is too expensive. Well, yeah, a diagnosis is very expensive. But hey, here's 1, 2, 3 ways that it can be paid for. So, or I guess 3. Yeah, 3, but 3 very, very solid routes that you can take to get on the pathway to get a diagnosis for autism. And is it easy? No, I did not say it would be easy. I didn't say that, but you either need accommodations or you don't. If you need accommodations, you are not going to survive without them. That's just how that works. That's why people get accommodations. That's literally what accommodations do. It evens the playing field. It doesn't give you a leg up. It just evens it. So, and then these other ideas of gender and race, we've made this huge idea that there's this hegemonic medical industrial complex. And okay, maybe there's a lot of biases and problems and money. There's all kinds of things wrong with the medical community. But to sit back and say that they are totally ignorant of the issue of, or to, not that they're totally ignorant, but to sit back and say, oh, it's just not fair for girls and people of color because of this pervasive issues. Guys, we've known since 2013, the medical community has known since 2013, that race and gender are an issue that need to be addressed and need to be considered. Are things perfect? No. But, doctors have been talking about this. So, where do you think people figured out this was a thing from? It was from studies and research and doctors and scientists publishing about it. So, people need to slow down about this discussion of privilege, which is where this whole conversation started, right? The privilege of being white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle class male, middle to upper class male, and supposedly that makes getting an autism diagnosis easier. And of course, yes, people will turn around and say that doesn't apply to the individual, but when we talk about it like groups like that, we miss this discussions about, why autism spectrum disorder even was changed, and some of the studies that prompted it. Of course, I didn't really have time to get into the details of specific studies on that, because that's not what this video is about, but we have to do more to talk about what is going on, instead of just pushing and pushing these narratives. And, these, like I said, these narratives are harmful, and they're spreading information that's just costing people. It is costing people money who might not have the money, and they're getting a diagnosis. They're autistic, and they could have gone through vocational rehab, but they didn't know about it, or they they assumed you had to have a diagnosis to get in there, or they assumed this, that, or the other, all kinds of things. Um, to, yeah, this is just a few things to start with as well, and this video is getting fairly long. I pretty much went on to kind of a rant, but hopefully as well there was some useful information with this, and that's what I'm hoping to tie into this. As much as I'm wanting to say, these things are wrong, there it there's a reason that I'm pointing that out, that they're wrong, which is because they're hiding things that are useful to know, or necessary to know, and things like that. So I'm gonna wrap up this video now, and thanks if anyone managed to stick around. Bye bye.